And North Korea isn't the only one hot under the collar about the South Korea-U.S. joint aerial drills. China is expressing its discontent with its own aerial exercises over the West Sea and the East China Sea, sending a strong message to Seoul and Washington.
Today, the issue, U.S.-China relations. Dawn, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me here tonight.
It's my pleasure. So to begin, I want to ask you if you could, big picture-wise, characterize current U.S.-China relations overall.
As Air Force wargaming in the region involves surface-to-air missile forces, fighter jets, and early warning aircraft. Though the drills involved multiple jets flying routes in areas it has never flown before, the Air Force spokesperson did not specify the day or days during which the drills took place or the exact locations the planes traveled. The Chinese Air Force said it will conduct high-sea exercises under combat conditions on a regular basis as it aims to improve readiness and safeguard the country's strategic interests.
It's a meeting of two of the most powerful men on the planet. Donald Trump touching down in China on Wednesday, welcomed by President Xi Jinping, one of the country's most dominant leaders in decades. They're set for top-level talks, with Trump widely expected to push Xi on his perennial gripes, trade and North Korea. But despite the inevitable sticking points, Beijing seems upbeat as the two go head-to-head.
So, Mike, I think the best way to look at the current state of U.S.-China relations is to think about it as both interdependence and competition. So from an interdependence standpoint, if you really think about it, China is the #1 source of imports for the U.S. economy and the #3 source of exports for the U.S. economy after Mexico and Canada. We also have a lot of investment going back and forth between our economies, and we cooperate on a number of different issues related to peace and security throughout the world. So we cooperate, we're interdependent, but we also have competitive aspects to our relationship with China as a rising power and with different interests between the two states. And that as a result, you need to plan for, various contingencies associated with that. So does China want to be a hegemon within Asia? We don't know that. I don't think there's a way to actually know that, given the lack of transparency in their system and the fact that they don't, claim that as a desire at this point. But you could look at certain behavior that indicates in the longer term they could potentially become a hegemon. Mm-hmm. Do they want a hierarchical system within Asia? There's nothing tangible that indicates that, but you look historically in the region, and China has played a different role at different points in time than it does today, and there's been different relations between states than what you have today. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very hard to say what China wants, other than China wants to protect what it sees as its sovereignty. And to continue to grow its economy. Yeah.
Okay. So the things you mentioned early in an earlier question, you mentioned a key word in my next question, and that has to do with the fact that no relationship survives friction. No international relationship among nations survives or exists without some friction. Mm-hmm. So I would ask you to give us some examples of some of the greatest disagreements between China and the United States.
North Korea, especially I would say over the last year or so, as North Korea's capability increases and as it becomes apparent that China and the U.S. have different interests associated. We've known this for a very long time, but obviously it's become a higher priority from a U.S. perspective, and China and the U.S. have differing views regarding how to resolve that issue, so I think that could be a potential point of stress.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you to look in a crystal ball and give us a couple of examples where the U.S. and China can and should cooperate more, specifically in Asia or maybe even in other parts of the world. What should we be working to do together?
I think the most probable areas of cooperation would be issues on which we have a shared interest. It's clear-cut as a shared interest. So basically, for example, global climate change. That's something that we could cooperate on. We both have an interest in, preventing that from occurring in the longer term. And that's something in the past we have cooperated on in certain ways. So that would be one. Developing green technology. Another potential area of cooperation would be in foreign aid provision or providing assistance to developing economies. In many cases, we play within that realm together from the standpoint of we're both providing foreign aid to individual countries, we're both providing various levels of technical assistance for economic development, and I think many countries would be able to learn quite a bit from both of our experiences. So that's something that I think we could do in a non-competitive way. Another example would be anti-piracy. We've seen this in the past with the Gulf of Aden. We have cooperated on those issues. Another would be United Nations peacekeeping operations, which China has been heavily involved with over the years. So those are a few examples. I mean, I think we have opportunities for cooperation, but we really need to focus on those areas where we have a shared interest, and there's not these debates over territorial integrity or over values that may not be the same between the U.S. and China.
Over the past few years, we've seen some instances where things had a potential to escalate. And I'm wondering if you have some specific recommendations that would give us some examples of the kinds of things the U.S. and China should be either doing to sort of eliminate these potential conflict areas, should we be doing, on things that we should be refraining from doing.
Yeah. I think the best advice to give on that would be that we need to increase communication as much as possible. So we need to have as much military-to-military cooperation that we can have that still obviously protects U.S. interests and isn't threatening our national security. But ultimately, more communication is better, because where I see the most likely areas of conflict would be, for example, on the East China Sea, not necessarily a misunderstanding, but a miscommunication or a very minor incident that then escalates into a crisis, and we don't have the proper communication between our militaries in order to de-escalate that in time. So that would be one example. So I do think we need to increase in that way. That said, many of our tensions are the result of an actual difference of interests, right? So how that's addressed in the longer term, I think, is difficult, in that our U.S. interests in the region going to change? Are China's interests in the region going to change? Perhaps. I mean, those are strategic decisions we make as a country over time. But assuming that those don't change, we have a situation where China is an authoritarian, politically communist regime, that there are sincere differences of opinion regarding how they govern their society and how the U.S. Governs ours. So, I mean, I think that's a fundamental difference. And the reason I bring that up is I think one of the discomforts with China as a rising power is not just that it's rising. It's that it's a rising power that doesn't necessarily share the same norms as the U.S. and the West on a number of key issues regarding governance of their population. So that will continue. I don't anticipate that is going to change in a dramatic way in the future. And as China's economic power grows, those tensions may escalate. And on territorial integrity, I don't think that the U.S. should be backing down from our commitments to allies in the region. I don't think that we should be allowing China to operate in a way that we don't think is a proper interpretation of international law. So I don't think we should back down on that. But I also think we need to increase communication so we can avoid a minor dispute turning into something much more serious.
That's a very well description of the situation, I think. A very, very helpful description of the situation, the things we should and should not be doing. Last question. Again, I want to ask you to speculate a little bit. What would you assess as the probability that conflict would erupt between the U.S. and China within the next 20 years?
I think it's a relatively low probability, and you have to look at different functional areas. So on the military side, for me, the most likely areas of conflict, again, would be East China Sea, South China Sea. There are scenarios under which North Korea could potentially become a conflict scenario between our two countries, because China still has a mutual defense treaty with North Korea and has recently re-articulated their commitment to that, to specify that if North Korea is aggressive towards another country and initiates conflict, China will essentially restrain itself and not become involved in that conflict. But that if North Korea is attacked, that China would contribute to the mutual defense of North Korea. So there are scenarios where if the U.S. engaged in a preventive or preemptive action against North Korea, that you could have a militarized dispute between China and the U.S. So there is potential. That's a relatively small probability. I think it's a higher probability today than it was a year ago or 2 years ago, just because of escalating tensions, and more because of the U.S. approach to the situation rather than the Chinese approach. So I think that's a growing area. Taiwan, as I said before, is always, there's the potential for that. So the military realm, I think it's unlikely, but could happen due to a relatively minor incident escalating. What I think that the more likely tension areas would be more of a Cold War type of environment that potentially could emerge either through China's actions or through U.S. actions. So if the U.S. continues to withdraw itself from the international order and China takes a leadership role and we continue to have these frictions regarding trade, and especially if either side takes trade action that then results in a trade war, you could have a ruptured U.S.-China economic relationship, with China having a sphere of influence economically, with certain countries and the U.S. So basically breaking up into blocks. I think that's much more likely than any sort of militarized dispute. And again, that really depends on both the actions of the U.S. and China. So that could happen. We also, I think, could have some breakdown of the overall international order due to many factors globally associated with nationalism and the downsides of globalization. So we may be seeing a fraying of the overall international order. So you may have an economic order that China leads in the longer term and one that the U.S. and the West leads, and have kind of, more similar to the actual Cold War rather than just having regional blocks, having, full-fledged systems that have different norms that govern them. So we may be at this turning point. So I think that's more likely than any sort of militarized dispute.
Okay, so low on the military side and maybe higher in the economic realm. Okay. Dr. Murphy, you've given us a lot to think about over this very short period of time. So on behalf of the Team SSQ and the entire SSQ audience, I want to thank you for sharing your experience with us and also sort of leading us to think strategically about this very important relationship between the U.S. and China. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for having me. Appreciate it.